Boa noite a todos. É com muita honra que a gente começa agora a palestra magna do 15º Colóquio em Economia, Política do Sistemas-Mundo. E nós temos a honra de ter o professor Salvatore Babones aqui com a gente, da Universidade de Sydney. So, I'm switching to English, obviously, because he comes from Australia. He's in Australia. So good evening to everyone. I have the honor to introduce Professor Salvatore Babones as our distinguished lecturer at the 15th Brazilian version of the Conference on the Political Economy of the World Systems. Professor Salvatore Babones is a sociologist whose research focuses on the political economy of the Indo-Pacific region. He is an author or editor of 10 books and more than 24 academic research articles. He publishes extensively on public policy issues and is a widely cited commentator on Australian higher education. He also has a distinguished production on the world systems perspective, and this is the main reason why we decided to send him an invitation, which was promptly accepted. Also, he has other media comments, interviews, and articles on Asia-Pacific politics, US-China relations, Australia's place in the great power disputes, and on contemporary populism. He published, along with Professor Christopher Chase Dunn, the Routledge Handbook of World System Analysis, and also the book American Tianxia, Chinese Money, American Power, and the End of History. And he has a very provocative thesis on this book, and I would like to hear from him about it as well. So I personally got acquainted with his work when I attended his presentation at the Pews conference in 2013 at the UC Riverside. I don't know if you remember this, Professor, in California, when Professor Chase Dunn organized that conference. And well, among these many publications, there is this paper, which is titled The Political Economy of the United States and the Structure of the Millennial World System, which bases his lecture in this evening. So it's an honor for us, Professor, to have you here with us to talk about your work, your research, and this paper specifically. And after your lecture, we are going to open for commentaries and questions and answers. So the word is with you, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation again.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I should clarify, first of all, that I'm not a colonial Australian. I am an imperialist American. So I've been here for almost 14 years. I've very much enjoyed it, but I am from the United States. And I should also clarify that I've become something of a heterodox sociologist, in that world systems analysis is a heterodox field. But within the field, I've now become a heterodox figure within the field. And I am very committed to the idea of social science as, well, not exactly as science epistemologically, but as an objective approach to understand the world, not as a normative approach to, well, some would say to reshaping the world, but I would say to trying to argue the world is what we would like it to be. I think perhaps one of the greatest weaknesses of world systems analysis has been that people want the world to be something it isn't. Now, I do write a lot that's normative, but I save my normative writing for the popular media. And in my social scientific work, I really am very committed to, well, to getting as close as objectivity as we can. And so you'll see in the presentation today that it's not typical of what you would expect from world systems analysis, but it does use all of the tools of world systems analysis to understand the world system. So without more ado, let me jump into it. I will try to go into presentation mode.
Yes. You just click there, and then there are options like present one window. Or...
Yes, I'm trying to. It just Microsoft security is trying to prevent me. They're having a tech war. Microsoft and Google are having a tech war right on my desktop. So hopefully you can see my slides loading on the new economic geography.
Okay. No,
there we go.
Yes.
And I'll make that full screen. And the title for the presentation, at least, is The Past, Present, and Future of Globalization. Let me just jump right into it. The globalization era that began in the 1970s seems to have played itself out. And I call this the globalization era because there was a discrete period between, really, if you go back, the trade statistics available don't quite go back to 1968, but the period between the collapse of the Bretton Woods currency system, a very controlled international trade and investment flows, 1968. There was a process. It didn't collapse at one moment, but between 1968 and 1972, the Bretton Woods system became no more. But since 1972, we've seen this massive increase in global trade as a percentage of GDP. And this era from, let's say, 1972 to 2008, we could think of as the globalization era. That is an era in which the world was globalizing as an active process. Since 2008, we've lived in a globalized world, but one that is no longer globalizing. And thus, I would say we now live in a post-globalization, or maybe just in a globalized world, where global trade as a percentage of GDP has been stagnant. It's still rising in unit terms and in money terms, but as a percent of global GDP, there's been virtually no increase in global trade for the last more than a decade. Then, of course, there was a massive dip during the first coronavirus year in 2020, a bump up in 2021. That's not reflected in the statistics, which are a bit delayed. This is 2019, the final year here. But if we were to bring this out to 2020 and 2021, we would see a further dip and then recovery. Now, trade is our usual indicator for globalization. If we look at investment, foreign investment flows are very much more volatile than global trade flows. But again, you can see a generally increasing trend and then a stagnation or a drop after 2008. Now, we're not really seeing deglobalization. What people call deglobalization is really just shifting production networks. So a production network that used to lead to China will then shift and lead from Vietnam. A chain that used to go to South Korea for textiles moved to China and is now moving to East Africa. But this isn't deglobalization, it's just shifting patterns of the fully globalized world in which we live. If we take a look at that world, global GDP is, depending on which year and whether you're using purchasing power units, et cetera, $75 trillion, maybe it's $80 trillion. Today, there's been the first iteration of this presentation is a few years old. I haven't updated all the figures, but it's not $75 trillion equally shared around the world. Of course, there's a large component in North America, a large component in Europe and the European Union, and a large component in East Asia. The entire rest of the world is less than a quarter of the global economy. And depending where you draw the borders of East Asia, if you include Southeast Asia and not just Northeast Asia, depending where you draw the borders of Europe, if you include Russia as part of Europe, you could say even less than 20% of the global economy. But it's not just that. The three major economic zones are each very well integrated within themselves. So if you take North America, roughly 50% of total international trade among the three major North American countries, Canada, United States, Mexico, nearly 50% of their international trade, more than 50% of their international trade is with the other two countries in North America. Now, that's remarkable considering there are only three countries and one of them is very large. If you were to unpack North America into actual economic regions, the northeastern US, the west coast of the US, the southeast of the US, the midwest of the US, and consider them as regions trading with each other, intra-regional trade would be far higher than 50%. But even with this not highly granular, very lumpy data of having only three countries in the zone, 50% or more of North American countries' trade is within North America. On top of that, the 87% of the zone, nearly 90%, is fully politically integrated. Now, I know the United States has different states, there are different state laws. There's some very minor constraints on trade within the United States, but practically speaking, the US is a single continental economy. And what this high integration means is that North America is at the same time the most productive economic zone in the world in terms of sheer output. It has most of its trade being within the zone, what Xi Jinping would call internal circulation. And it also has a single political infrastructure for governing the economy. Whether you agree with that regulation or not, it's certainly a highly integrated set of economic regulations. In Europe, considering just the European Union or European Union and its affiliates, so European Union, Norway, and Switzerland, I think is the list. Intra-European trade is 69% of the total trade of the European Economic Region. Now, of course, that's been driven by the rise of the European Union, but it is and it's also driven by the fact that Europe is much more granular than North America. So it's one of these interesting empirical questions. Is the North American economy more integrated, or is the European economy more integrated? We actually can't tell because we don't have any statistics on intra-regional trade within North America, that is within the United States as a collection of regions. But if we think of the European Union as a collective collection of regions, we do have data on trade between the countries of the European Union, which are, in many cases only slightly larger or even smaller than individual US states. Nonetheless, it's certainly a well-integrated economic region. Okay. There is weak political integration of 94% of the zone. So when I say weak political integration, I mean the European Union, which is not as much a single economic zone as the United States. There's certainly a very strong effort in the European Union to make it a single economic zone, but it certainly is not as well integrated as the US economy. And of course, with Brexit, now the zone has become even less integrated. Only 78% of the broader European economy, the European Union plus UK, Norway, Switzerland, only 78% of it is actually within the EU. If we go to Northeast Asia, again, most trade within Northeast Asia is intra-regional trade. Now, the figure is actually higher than that. The only intra-regional figure that's available without doing an enormous amount of data work on your own is a figure for intra-Asian trade, which includes India, which is poorly connected to, say, Japan and Korea. If we were just looking at the countries of Northeast Asia, we would have an even higher level of intra-regional trade. But of course, only 2/3 of the Northeast Asian zone is within a single governance zone, subject to a single set of rules. And that's a very poor set of rules. So China may have a single, a unified single economy, but it's subject to arbitrary regulation. There's no independent judiciary. There's very weak rule of law. China has a lot of problems as a trading zone. When we zoom out and kind of think of this in broadly competitive terms, we have one economic zone, North America, that's the largest of the three zones, that's the most integrated of the three zones, and that probably has the highest quality governance if we define quality not in social justice terms, but in the effectiveness of governance for businesses working in the zone. Right, so it has the, I don't want to put a value-laden term on it, but it has the most, well, I'll just leave it at quality. It has the highest level of governance of its economy of any of the three zones. So all of this would make it tend to be a dominant economic region to begin with. But then when we consider the linkages between the zones, from North America, sorry, the days seem to have disappeared. From North America to Western Europe, it's roughly a 10-day trip by container ship. They're very close to each other. In fact, you can probably get a container from New York to Rotterdam faster than you can get a container from New York to California. So the North American zone is very closely connected via sea trade to the European zone. It's also very closely connected to the East Asian zone, about 15 days by container ship from Japan or Taiwan to California, maybe 17 days from Shanghai. Well, what about Belt and Road? The whole point of China's Belt and Road Initiative was initially to reconnect Eurasia, to connect China to markets in Europe. And in many ways, it was, I think, viewed in China initially as a reorientation of China's economy away from its East Coast ports and trade with the United States and towards its Western interior and trade with Eurasia. Well, the problem is it takes 30 days by container ship to get from China to Europe, twice as long as that from China to the United States. If you do it by train, you can get that down to 15 days. So you can get China being as closely integrated to Europe as the US is to Asia, but only if you apply massive subsidies. That is, it costs 3 to 4 times as much to ship freight by rail as it does to ship it by ship. It's also much lower capacity to do so. The One Belt, One Road rail trade between East Asia and Western Europe can only ever be a thin straw. It will never replace the sheer scale of container shipping that connects China to the rest of the world. I don't know if I have the number in here. I think the total trans-Eurasian rail capacity is roughly equal to, I think it is 2 days of container shipping from Shanghai. Annual capacity on the rail is equal to 2 days of port capacity for a single port. And China has multiple large ports. Shanghai's the largest, but it's not the only one. All right, well, I'm going to continue to push home this case. We've talked about size of the economy, integration of the economy, governance of the economy, but we can go even further. GDP per capita in North America has now dramatically outstripped that in Europe and Asia. I mean, when I went to graduate school in the 1990s, I was used to the idea that the US, Western Europe, and Japan were all developed countries, were all core countries, to use the world systems lingo for it, and that they were all roughly equal, that we could draw policy lessons from each other. They were a rich countries club. The OECD is often called a rich countries club. Well, that gap has really opened up over the last 20 or 30 years. Today, Germany, not the richest, but the leading economy of Europe. I mean, the Netherlands is richer, but the Netherlands is much smaller. Germany has a GDP per capita that's roughly on a par with that of Alabama. Now, when you think of Alabama, Alabama is a relatively poor state in the southeastern United States. It's nobody's idea of a great world leader in technology, manufacturing, and infrastructure, yet it's on a par with Germany. Japan's even poorer. Japan is on a par with Mississippi. There is just an extraordinary difference in levels of income. California, so if you think of Japan faces California across the Pacific Ocean, and if you think of them as relatively similar economies, no, California's GDP per capita is double the GDP per capita of Japan, double. If you think of it in terms of Germany, if you compare it to the northeastern US, so the area that runs from Virginia through to Maine, Germany's GDP, well, northeastern US's GDP is a full 70% higher than Germany's. And to give some other comparisons, the US as a whole is 25% higher GDP per capita than Germany. The US as a whole is 50% higher GDP than France. These are no longer commensurate regions of the world. And while it may shock our imagination, it shouldn't if we start thinking about things in more open ways. So, for example, manufacturing in the United States has fled the Midwest and Northeast and is concentrated in the Southeast. So states like Alabama, Tennessee are now major manufacturing states in the US. That's where new automobile manufacturing is located. When Japan has moved auto plants to the US, they've typically, and Japanese companies have, they've typically moved them to the southeastern US. Well, they're moving it to the area of the US that is still poor enough to specialize in manufacturing. Same thing for Germany. We think of Germany as a manufacturing powerhouse, but manufacturing is no longer the highest value-added portion of global value chains. Manufacturing, even advanced manufacturing, is high, but if you think of a firm like TSMC, a Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC has the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing technologies in the world. They outstrip even Intel. Intel has now had to outsource some of its most advanced chips to TSMC. But TSMC is nowhere near the top of the league tables of profitability of tech companies. It's down in the 20s range, because the most advanced, or at least the most remunerative areas of the global economy are now in the intangible sphere, are now the Googles, Apples, Facebooks, Microsofts of the world, not the TSMCs. The most advanced manufacturers in the world, TSMC, are nowhere near, well, Google and like when it comes to profitability. Now, if this again offends your sensibilities and you think, I've traveled to Mississippi, I've traveled to Japan, clearly Japan's more technologically advanced. It has its super amazing high-speed rail network. It has all these robotics and electronics. Well, in Mississippi, it's pretty common for middle-class people in Mississippi to have a 4-bedroom house with 2 cars, and not just 2 cars, but to own pickup trucks. More than half of the vehicles in the United States are trucks, pickup trucks and SUVs, not actual passenger cars. So imagine a Japanese person in a tiny little Toyota Corolla driving to a high-speed rail station, and contrast that to a person in Mississippi driving a Ford F-150 pickup truck on an enormous highway to their 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. That'll just give you some idea of how different geographies choose to spend their resources. But in terms of the amount of resources they have available, well, Japan and Mississippi statistically are on the same level. As the globalization era ends, globalization was about manufacturing production networks. It was about how the way we make things shifted from making things within our countries to making things somewhere else and shipping them to our countries. As this globalization era ends, and we're now in a global era, US economic dominance is consolidating. Now, this is what alienated me from most of the world systems community. The world systems community, and led by the late Emanuel Wallerstein, was absolutely convinced, still is absolutely convinced, that the final crisis of capitalism began in 1968, that we are now 50 years, more than 50 years into the final crisis of capitalism. The US is a declining hegemon that, according to Emanuel Wallerstein, was only hegemonic between 1950 and 1965 or so. That is, to him, end of World War II to the beginning of Vietnam was the sole period of US dominance in the world. And this narrative, to me, just, well, is wholly at odds with the reality in which I live. In fact, to me, as the world of manufacturing globalization has ended, so we've reached a point where anything can be made anywhere in the world. And yes, US manufacturing has moved out to Asia and it's been hollowed out. But manufacturing is no longer the dominant production network of our world. It's no longer the leading industry. And people who want to measure hegemony by manufacturing, well, they might look back to older literatures on dominance in which steel production was the key indicator used for dominance. And by that measure, well, For a while, South Korea dominated the world until Chinese steel production outstripped South Korean steel production. It's just no longer a meaningful indicator. Steel is a cheap commodity. Manufacturing is just a commodity activity, even at the very highest levels of semiconductor manufacturing. What we are seeing is a world towards a move towards a world of not just services, but of networks and of intangible value chains. And those intangible value chains are disproportionately centered in the United States. Thus, you see figures like US stock market dominance. If you were to add up what the market is valuing the world's production networks at, how the market thinks, what the market thinks global production networks are worth, well, US firms take more than half of total global stock market capitalization. But it's not just the stock market. When we have trouble finding indicators. We're so used to using simple GDP as the indicator that as we move to a new structure of the global economy, we lack the indicators for understanding the intangible economy. I can rattle off Google, Facebook, Apple, all you want, but I don't have statistics, a systematic statistical infrastructure to demonstrate their dominance. All I can say is we all know that Google, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft are dominant, except in China. So China has exempted itself. And Emanuel Wallerstein wrote a fantastic article 50 years ago, casting the Soviet Union as a counter-hegemonic attempt to exempt itself from a US-dominated global economy. And I think that that idea is very applicable to China. China has come to the understanding that it can only rise so far within American-dominated value chains, and that after it reaches after it stabilizes in that system, it can only continue to rise by taking itself out of the system. Now, if it takes itself out of the system, it might succeed, it might fail, but at least then it has policy room for maneuver. That is, as a separate system, China can become a challenger to the US. But within the existing world system, it's relegated to a subsidiary role. And that was the theme of my book, American Tiansha, China, United States, Chinese money, American power, and the end of history. The book was about how as long as China remains integrated into a US-dominated world system, it will never become a serious challenger to the US. Well, it is, of course, a challenger online. And if you think about it, it's a challenger online precisely because it has separated its internet from the US internet. So the big Chinese internet giants, the Alibabas of the world, the Tencents of the world, they only thrive because they have a captive home market. Now, Alibaba has had some success, particularly in developing countries, and also a bit in Europe, but it has had nowhere near the success of Amazon becoming in global competition. And a lot of that is because Alibaba, once it leaves the Chinese market, is always a follower. Right? So Amazon has realized that it's not just about selling books, it's not just about selling goods. Amazon now makes most of its money from Amazon Web Services. So what Amazon does, although we think of Amazon and Alibaba as competitors, in fact, Amazon's main business is selling web services to other businesses. Now, Alibaba is doing that, but it's doing that with a 5 or 10 year delay behind Amazon. And similarly, Amazon now has become a movie studio. Now, you would think, why should a mail order retailer become a movie studio? Well, Amazon's come to realize that that's what's sticking people to their platform, and it's trying to make people part of an Amazon. It's trying to tie people into an Amazon universe with Amazon Prime and access to Amazon digital content. And again, I'm sure Alibaba will go that direction, but it's never quite getting there because in the rest of the world, it's always one step behind Amazon, whereas in China, Alibaba is absolutely dominant. But now we're seeing a shift that makes this even clearer. We're seeing, and I put that up last, Mobike, Mobike is the Chinese example. There are Razor, Scoot. I mean, there are now dozens of mobility companies that are converting bicycles into from goods into services. What we're seeing with Mobike and other Western copycat firms is a transition from goods as things you own to, of course, things you use. Now we see that very clearly in the bicycle and scooter industry, where people are no longer buying a bicycle, but they're using an e-bike that's sitting on the side of the street. That doesn't have much implication for the volume of manufacturing. Same number of bicycles are being produced. Even more bicycles, actually, in recent years are being produced. But it has big implications for the value in the sector, the distribution of value in value chains. In the bicycle value chain, the value that used to go to the top-end manufacturers is now being diverted and is going to network-based technology companies. And of course, it's not just bicycles, it's the entire economy of things being turned into an economy of services, or an economy of networks. And I like to use this kind of paradigm, this kind of mental shorthand for thinking about it. The globalization era was the era of hardware. It was an era where things were bought and sold across borders. They could be measured in the international data infrastructure. We would have a record of which things had moved, what they were valued at, how they were taxed at customs, etc. We went through a transitional phase in the 1990s and early 2000s where software became increasingly dominant. The shift from the IBMs of the world to the Microsofts of the world. But I think that was only a transitional phase. What's really happened, the final culmination of this shift, is a shift towards what I like to call netware. That is, do I have the definition here? Yeah, okay. Production systems that generate value from the interconnectedness of people and or things. And I put that in question mark. It's a working definition. I'm not sure where netware is going to end up ultimately. But the idea of the netware economy is that it's not really about software. I mean, the value in a company like Uber or Mobike is not in that smartphone app. The value is in the network connecting people who want transportation to people who are willing to drive, or the network connecting people who want a bicycle to bicycles on the road, or ultimately, with the rise of the Internet of Things, the connection between things. So the self-driving car that a person is in communicating with other cars in a networked environment. The real value in companies like Uber and Mobike and Lime, the real value in them is not their software. Some may have better software, some may have worse software. The real value is in the network they own, the netware economy. The netware economy, it's difficult to put it on a chart or a map or a graph. We just don't have systematic data on this, but it's very clearly, overwhelmingly centered in North America. In fact, I have actually, in seminars, in in-person seminars, asked people to name netware companies, companies based on the value of the social graph. I've asked them to name netware companies that are not from the US or China, since China is a protected market. And if you look by value, I mean, people do mention vKontakte in Russia and a few others, but again, these are geographically restricted. There's an Iranian social network. Well, it's useless outside Iran. There's a Russian social network. It's useless outside Russia. If you think of global netware companies that actually have a global reach, the highest European example anyone's been able to give me is Spotify, which is based in Sweden. And so if you think about US and Western Europe, the US has the Google, Apple, Facebook, Elon Musk's, et cetera, of the world, and Europe's top competitor is Spotify. Well, then you get some idea of just the scale of dominance of the United States in the new online value chains. It's just extraordinary. Now, I might go back to Jaffe. Gary Jaffe, of course, was early on one of the early participants in world systems debates. He's since moved on and become much more a business school sociologist, but his work was foundational in thinking about global production networks and global value chains. And this is just a standard chart he used in many of his early articles, thinking about the structure of value chains. Now, he put this from low coordination to high coordination. I think this chart would have made much more sense the other way, thinking of it historically as a move from hierarchy to market. That is, what we have seen in the globalization era, what we saw in the globalization era was a move from hierarchy. General Electric built its own appliances and sold them to consumers in retail stores that it had an agreement with, a very hierarchical production network, towards various forms of subcontracting, to now what might be called a market-based value chain or a market-based production network. Only Jaffe got something wrong. He thought the market was the least coordinated, had the least power asymmetries of any production network. I actually suspect that in many ways, this has been reversed. That in fact, it's the market-based production networks that have the highest level of highest power asymmetries. So although explicit coordination is highest in the hierarchical firm and lowest in the market, because explicit coordination means the leader of the chain, that the General Electric slapping its logo on a product is determining everything about how it's made. Whereas in the market production network, well, the ultimate brand is simply buying something from a OEM, from an original equipment manufacturer, with very little say in how production is done. So certainly Jaffe was right about degree of coordination, but I think he was wrong about power asymmetry. I think we've seen a shift towards modular and market-based production networks where the power asymmetry has grown. In a hierarchical production network, well, the employees at a manufacturing company based in a particular town, they could go on strike, right? They could refuse to work. They could get good contracts. Germany's automakers are fully unionized, and they have to negotiate with the metalworkers union, or they won't be able to make cars. The very hierarchical production network, automobile manufacturing in Germany, is actually one where power asymmetries are not that severe compared to a modular production network where there are massive power asymmetries between, say, Walmart, who is buying kitchen equipment like blenders and microwave ovens. They're stocking it from turnkey suppliers in Asia. Well, the turnkey supplier is being gouged for every last penny in that value chain to get Walmart or Apple or the ultimate brand is squeezing much more value out of the value chain. And now we've seen this result in the end in these market-based value chains. And you might think of Uber as the prime example, where there is a customer, you on the mobile phone booking your Uber, and a driver who's driving for you. Well, these are the most power asymmetric of all. The customers, and whether you think of Uber as the customer or you as the ride hailer as the customer, have all the power, and the people providing the product have very little. But Uber's an archetypical example, but I think an even better example is the market for earbuds. All the major mobile phone companies have moved to having wireless earbuds as their sound device. Well, none of them make wireless earbuds. They're all bought in China. Chinese factory they're not even bought on contract. It's not even a turnkey supplier where, Apple provides maybe with Apple it is, but where Samsung provides specifications, or let's say a Beats. Beats is one of the major sellers of headphones. Beats doesn't provide the specification to a turnkey supplier. In fact, Beats goes to China goes to a trade show, there are hundreds of suppliers of headphones and earbuds there at the trade show, and the lead firm simply goes to them and says, I'll take 2 million of these and 200,000 of those at these price points. Well, in that market-based production network, the producers have virtually no power because they have no access to the customer. And ultimately, all of this is about who owns the customer. You know, that's why Facebook is so desperately trying to monetize its platform. They owe the customer, but they're not sure what they can sell to the customer besides advertising. Google owns the customer, and then it owns our internet experience, and it tries to monetize that. Microsoft is fighting with Google, giving me security warnings about using a Google product because Microsoft owns the customer on my desktop, and it wants to make sure. Apple owns the customer when it comes to the iPhone, right? So owning the customer gives you much more power in these market-based production networks than any integrated firm ever had in the mid-20th century. The newly emerging netware business models are thus both modular and even market-oriented, but they're also highly monitored. So it's not just that they have more power, they're actually able to see what is going on in a kind of omniscient panopticon way when the producers in these production networks don't have access to it. So again, if we think of Uber as the archetypical case, Uber knows what other Uber drivers are being paid, how many cars are on the road at the time, how many drivers are available, what demand is. They've done modeling to know how demand is likely to change over time. They have all the information. That information comes out of their ownership of the social graph. They even outsource some of their monitoring. So when you give a rating to a driver, you're actually doing Uber's work for it. Uber doesn't have to have a camera in every car to monitor the driver's behavior. The customer is going to monitor the driver's behavior and provide the feedback to Uber, right? And this is true not just of Uber, but of every time we rate a purchase on Amazon, every time we review a business for Google, we are providing information to the netware company that has not just our information. And this is the crucial thing. There's this myth, especially outside the US, in Australia and Europe, maybe in Brazil, there's this myth that our data has value and we should return value to the people who own it. So, I, Salvatore Babones, should get a penny for the data that I provide to Google. It's like, no. My data is worthless. The social graph has value. So my data, in conjunction with your data, provides insights and information. The real value is not in my data. The real value is in the network of data that the netware company is able to see. Now, we can't measure any of this, right? I mean, these are all assertions, and I've been criticized in writing for making these assertions without providing any data. And the problem is, the data just don't exist. So, for example, if I want to study Apple and how Apple is transforming global value chains and thus ultimately countries' positions in the world systems hierarchy, well, the data tell me that Apple's based in Ireland. And so when you buy something on the App Store, it's booked as income in Ireland. And actually, Ireland's GDP has now been so warped by tech companies being based in Ireland due to their low tax structure. It's become so warped that the Irish central bank has to issue two parallel sets of GDP statistics. Their GDP, as it legally is reported to the IMF and goes up the line, and their GDP ex Apple. That is the Ireland central bank actually tries to strip out these offshore companies that merely have a PO box in Ireland because it so warps their statistics as to make them useless. If you see GDP growth in Ireland this year is 6%, all that means is Apple made more money. It doesn't mean that the Irish economy is actually benefiting Irish people. Okay. All sorts of imports and exports they just are impossible to trace using the data we have. We can trace physical product movement across borders using WTO data, but we can't track value. And that's become a serious problem. In fact, I recently bought a pair of Nike sneakers from the Nike Australia store. So I was on the nike.com.au store. I bought a pair of Nike sneakers in Australian dollars. They were shipped from, I believe it's Cambodia, I think is where they were made, to Australia. And I got an international transaction charge from my bank. And I said, why am I getting a $6 charge? I bought these in Australia using Australian currency. And it turns out that, yes, but I actually bought those shoes from a Dutch subsidiary of Nike. So I have an American company selling me shoes from Cambodia in Australia on an Australian store, and it's being booked in the Netherlands. Why the Netherlands? I don't know. But because they were charging me internationally in Australian dollars, I had to pay an international transaction fee to my credit card company. Now, good luck tracking that through the international data infrastructure. We just don't have the data to measure these things. And this has been my biggest challenge in trying to argue this narrative with other people, not just in the world systems world, but in the international relations world, in academia more broadly, is that things that I can give tons of anecdotes about, I just don't have data about. Okay. One thing is clear, this emerging netware economy is primarily Pacific. That is, the world of manufacturing pre-globalization was an Atlantic world. The world of netware, the post-globalization world, is primarily a Pacific world. We've seen a shift towards intangible economy, both in the United States and in China. In many ways, China has become the leader of that shift. It's just that China's intangible economy, well, is protected by the Great Firewall from invaders, but it's also prevented by the Great Firewall from getting out of China. One potential caveat: it is possible as we move towards an intangible economy that it will no longer be shaped by physical geography. And in fact, maybe the leading zone for app development is in Bangalore in India. India has a lot of advantages in the intangible economy. It has a very large domestic market. It has an open information environment, so there's no big Great Firewall like in China. It has a Western or a legal system that is familiar to Western American internet giants. It has a slowly functioning but rule of law legal system. That is, India, even though its legal system works badly in the sense of it's very slow, it does seem to give fair outcomes. International companies can get a fair hearing in India. And then crucially, perhaps, for India's future success, it has a large number of people. And I say crucially because if you're developing a new app and you're using any kind of machine learning, having a large user base is what makes machine learning more efficient. The more users you have, the bigger your social graph, the better your algorithms. And so India has the opportunity to, I think, leapfrog China in the app economy because of its openness, but it has the ability to compete in the first place because of its size. All right, quick note on China, because I've studied China really for 20 years. Well, last 10 years, I've put a lot of work into studying China. We tend to think of China's growth as going on forever. I've been saying since 2010, and I can give you the article citations, that China's growth would stop around 2020. Now, I didn't predict the coronavirus, but I just predicted convergence, that China would reach world average levels of GDP around 2020 and then stop growing. And in fact, what we've seen is that the eastern coastal provinces, which are the richest places in China, around Beijing and Tianjin, the Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta, those richer coastal provinces that are now at South Korean levels of GDP, they have the slowest growth rates. So the very slowest growth rate in China is in Beijing, which is also the richest area in China. Yangtze River Delta, Pearl River Delta, all slow growth. Most of the growth in China has moved to the much poorer provinces inland. My assertion all along has been that China's incredible economic growth between 1980 and 2010, even 2020, was mainly due to China bouncing back from the Great Leap Forward. That it was ironically, so that it was not that China had a good policy. It's that China simply had terrible policies in the past and has now bounced back. And China now, remember, it's slightly richer than Brazil, slightly poorer than Mexico. When I say China's poorer than Mexico, Americans think I'm crazy, and I just point them to the statistics. Even by the official statistics, China is poorer than Mexico. By the best estimates of economists using indirect means to measure China's economic output, China's roughly at the same GDP per capita as Brazil, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, if you use unofficial figures. All right. So what we have is a global economy that is coalescing in the post-globalization era, in the globalized era, in the global economy era, is coalescing around North America. Yes, because of the old style physical factors. It's a big economy, it has good governance, it has lots of trade within the zone. But even more so, because on top of that initial advantage, the netware economy, the intangible economic networks of the 21st century are becoming extraordinarily concentrated in North America. The highest value is being gained in North America, and that these netware economies are going to be rock solid stable. That is, it's extraordinarily difficult to change your position in a network. It's not so hard, it's hard, but not so hard to have mobility in a hierarchy, to move up from bottom to top in a linear hierarchy. But networks are like webs. They're enmeshing countries in their positions in the global economy. And I think it's going to be much harder for other countries to break out of that. The US dominance, I strongly suspect, is not only solid today, but still becoming more solid, which is to say, whether you're pro-American or anti-American, I take no position on this. US economic dominance is here to stay, at least for this century, and in all likelihood for the next century as well. All right, thanks everybody. I'm not exactly sure how to, there we go, stop presenting. And love to have a discussion.
Wow, that was really food for thought, as you guys usually use this expression, right? Thank you very much, Professor Salvatore. I would invite our audience to write questions. Vocês podem escrever em português, vocês podem escrever em inglês, a gente ajuda a traduzir se vocês tiverem questões para trazer para o debate. E eu não sei se alguém gostaria de começar. Eu tenho minhas questões aqui.
Eu posso começar.
Okay, so we do like a first round of questions, and then we go to the discussions and move on. Pedrinho.
Professor, your conference has been wonderful. I think a kind of issues, a kind of arguments, and of course data that shake our way of thinking.
Gente, eu falei para a Lei ontem e agora então.
And it's for me, it's hard to understand, to see what's going on, but I have a question. This which measure this changes, and for say mass production economy, for network economy, in which measure this change may change deeply the way as the world system has been working in the last 500 years or 100 years. That's my question. And another related to this, you have watched it only for economy, but when we look to the political side of the world system, and if we accept the Giovanni Arrighi model of hegemony, do you really think that American hegemony, in the sense that Giovanni Arrighi used the term, that in that sense, U.S. hegemony is still strong, or it's a little more, it's weak? Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question. I think viewing things in a 500-year perspective, I think the real problem is over 500 years we get used to things. We get used to thinking of the world in certain terms. And the 500-year perspective is that perspective of the rise of modernity. Modernity has been associated with the creation of nation states, the division of the world into sovereignties, this creation of physical power structures. It was associated with high levels of warfare between state actors, the tangible economy, the production of things. I think that we are now seeing that world disappear. And so if I were to say, like, what's the real transition, if there is a major transition, it's not a transition of hegemony within the modern world economy that has occurred since 1970. It is a transition from the modern world to the postmodern world. We now live in a postmodern world where, frankly, national borders are less relevant. They're still relevant, but they're much less relevant than they were. We live in a world without major systemic warfare. Most peaceful time in world history. Yes, I know there's lots of conflict in the Middle East, but the conflicts that are occurring tend to be non-state conflicts. They tend to be conflicts over who will govern a particular civilian population. We see very few examples in the last 70 years of a country invading another country to take its territory. So we've seen a deterritorialization of the world. And this shift to postmodernity, I suspect, is going to make hegemony as a modern concept less relevant, maybe irrelevant. So I personally don't call the United States hegemonic. I tried in American Tianxia to reintroduce that Chinese word, Tianxia, all under heaven. That the United States, in some sense, operates much more like a Ming dynasty coordinator of the world. So the way the Ming dynasty operated within East Asia, I try to generalize to how the US operates in the world. It's not exactly hegemony. It's a more diffuse power structure. And I have a paper on this, the transition from imperialism, hegemony, and Tianxia, arguing that Tianxia is a more diffuse form of control. So I think US control is more effective than ever, but it's not based on the tools of hegemony. Just as, if we think of this, I'm sorry to go on very long with this answer, but I think this is just such a fundamental question. We've all gotten used to the idea that the US doesn't have colonies. Right? So imperialism as a form of control meant direct conquest of colonies. Britain was an imperialist in India. France was an imperialist in Africa. We then shifted from that to really much more of a model of hegemony, where while the US did not in the 20th century operate through conquering countries and governing them, it was indirect governance. And now I think we're moving to a final model, or at least a model for the new postmodern world system, which is not based on direct application of power. The power is still there. The aircraft carriers are still in the ocean, but it's much more based on people responding to incentive structures. So people who hate the US on Facebook, searching for counter-hegemonic articles on Google, and insisting on payment for their organizations in US dollars. That's really what it's all about.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have two questions, Professor. First is on the issue of, and then we can pass to José Carlos afterwards. The first is the issue of inequality, right? So you portrayed, okay, I agree. I understand when you say that manufacturing is not the key indicator for dominance anymore, right? So we are living in a service and this network society that you portrayed. But when we look at the US today, we see the curve of inequality rising rapidly. So the US, can we say that the United States is still dominant in production and services, but the Americans, their purchasing power is decreasing, so they can't buy anymore as much as they can produce, right? So the first question is this issue of inequality. So the West, like, and you can also apply this to Europe, right? So you have the citizens that can't have the same standards of living that our parents have, my parents had, right? Like 30, 40 years ago. And the second question is about the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. And I have your book here, and it's very provocative. Some of the subtitles, right? So you say, like, one subtitle is "One Belt and Road to Nowhere," right? And it's interesting. It's provocative because, in my opinion, or at least
that's why they didn't publish the book in China.
Really?
The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences is going to do a translation, and they said, we can't have your chapter ridiculing Belt and Road.
Well, unbelievable. And my question is that, as Professor Pedro said, if you bring this to a geopolitical perspective, maybe China is doing exactly what the US did in the post-World War, which is like politically buying new friends. So if you take like Central Asia and Southeast Asia, okay, it is artificial. They are spending money with no market or profit mind in the short term, but it's like creating new captive markets to ensure that WeChat and Alibaba and Didi in like 10, 20 years will manage to overcome American dominance, right? So
so first on inequality, as a corrective, inequality is not rising out of control in the West. It's rising out of control in the English-speaking world, primarily in the United States. And look, that's a terrible social problem. But for anyone who thinks that that is destructive of American dominance, just think of the impoverishment of the British worker in the 19th century. In Britain's period of total global imperial dominance, British workers benefited hardly at all. It's no coincidence that Marx wrote Capital in England, not in Germany, because it was actually in England that inequality became the biggest social problem, not in continental Europe. So I think it's a false equivalence to kind of think that a dominant country must also be a good country. You know, we've seen plenty of examples throughout history of countries that have terrible treatment of their own citizens, you know, nonetheless being at the center of things. And I don't think, although I have written a lot about U.S. inequality, criticizing it, I don't think it's any barrier to U.S. dominance in the world. U.S. conceived of as a broader entity, not as a collection of people. Obviously, factory workers in the U.S. are not dominant in the world, but the U.S. in some sense is. China, I don't think, can challenge that using physical territorial means. That is, as China buys allies, it's really, I would say, renting allies. And we've seen that in country after country, that as long as China continues the subsidies, the alliance continues. The minute China cuts off the subsidy, it disappears. That's happened in Ethiopia with a change of government. It's happened in Kazakhstan. I think China's, I can't even call it an alliance structure because these countries have not in any way formally allied with China. But China's system of friends is all based on China subsidizing its friends. When it comes to the U.S. has consistently extracted value from the places it worked with. I mean, the U.S. extraction of value from Latin America in the 20th century is legendary. I don't have to talk to Latin Americans about that. China, on the other hand, is subsidizing, and you can't build an empire by subsidizing your clients. It's a negative feedback loop, not a positive feedback loop.
Okay. Zeca or his brother, José Thiago.
Good night, everyone. My name is Thiago. I'm a historian from São Paulo State, and I want to make a question for you, Professor. That is, what is the paper of the big techs, just like Alphabet and Facebook and Huawei, in the political organization of the globalization and the future of globalization? Because I believe that the political papers of these companies are grow up in the last 20 years and in the next 20 years too. What do you think about, Professor?
I think you mean like a political role, right?
The political roles.
Role, yeah. Okay.
The political actuations of these companies and determining elections, the papers of the Facebook, the papers of the Russian government that has a organization to acting in the internet. And what do you think about these questions? The political and technology, now and in the future.
It's not my area of specialty. I do think that the influence of technology giants has been grossly exaggerated. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I'm just saying that U.S. elections, at least, and other elections that I'm aware of, have, if there's been an influence, it's been a very small shift of a few percentage points. Now, a very small shift of a few percentage points might change an election outcome, but it doesn't change the character of the political system. That is, the competitors in the system were always going to be competitors anyway. They were always going to be competitive anyway. And very often, people think I'm too sanguine about challenges to democracy. And I just remind them that, well, for example, the 2000 election in the United States, George Bush versus Al Gore, was clearly stolen by the Republican Party. There's tons of statistical evidence, not just about Florida, but in Ohio, clearly stolen by the Republican Party. Yeah, that had massive effects. It led to the war in Iraq, and it led to the Patriot Act, and lots of terrible outcomes as a result. Did it change the structure of the global system? It's just a blip. So was the 2016 election swayed by Russia's Facebook ads? Maybe it was, but again, I don't think it changes much in the longer scheme of things. So it's not that it's not that as a citizen I'm untroubled by these things. It's that as a social scientist and as a structural social scientist, I don't think it has much effect. I mean, ultimately, these network companies are very afraid of the U.S. Congress, and they're very amenable to political oversight, and not just the U.S. Congress. I mean, here in Australia, Facebook and Google ultimately accepted a special tax that's only applied on Facebook and Google to support Australian news. Well, they initially wanted to fight it, and then they decided that, well, They just can't, you know, and they had to give in. And so even a relatively smaller country like Australia has been able to regulate Facebook and Google in the most direct ways, making them pay money. So yeah, I'm not so much worried that internet giants will undermine politics. I see them much more as a tool of specifically American dominance than as a shadow emperor or a shadow empire in their own right. But I don't know. That's just my impression. I don't study it.
Nice. Fabinho.
Hello, Professor. Good night. Thank you for your presentations. Really inspiring. I have two questions. First is more technical. You were talking about lack of data. I was wondering if the economic complexity index can translate in some way this essential process that you just described. And so I would like to hear from you about this. And the second question is more exploring this difference between modern world system and postmodern world system. My question is if this postmodern world system is or will be based on a capitalist world economy, or it will be a different kind of system? That is my question. Thank you.
The economic complexity index is useless. I use their website because it's nice visualizations, but the problem is they have the same problem I have. They only have the available data infrastructure with which to work. So what they call economic complexity is calculated based on the composition of imports and exports, not on the economy itself. So for example, Australia in the economic complexity index has one of the lowest levels of economic complexity in the world because Australia's exports, 70% by value, are iron ore. So Australia is the Saudi Arabia of iron. Yet Australia has an extremely complex economy, you know, at very high technology levels. And, you know, so it just depends on, unfortunately, imports and exports don't tell us enough about a country to support that kind of analysis. And we don't have the data we would want. The data we would want is all proprietary. So there are some companies that have produced various indexes about composition of the economy, not in a global sense, but like there's a company that has done the Australian economy and measuring the complexity of the Australian economy based on transactions data. So the company's a transactions processor. And so they can put transactions into codes of what industry. And that's the kind of data we need. But we're never going to have that globally. It's simply, you know, our international data infrastructure was set up in 1949, and it reflects 1949 viewpoints. I mean, even the raw data on which economic complexity index is based, if you want data on hardware, nuts, bolts, screws, you can get that data down to 6-digit SIC, and I can tell you how many screws a country exported that have a flat head with a slot and are 3/4 inches long versus how many screws a country exported that are rounded head with a Phillips head and that are 1 inch long. I can give you that data, but electronic communication networks, all one figure. So, you know, there's nothing you can do with it. The postmodern world system is a work in progress. I don't know that so whether or not it will be capitalist depends on your personal definition of capitalism. Each of us has a different personal definition. Will it be market-based? Yes. So it's clearly, there's clearly been no move away from market-based economies. In fact, I think that the netware economies are even more market-based. Whether that's capitalist or not, well, use your definition of capitalism. But market-based, absolutely.
Okay,
Thank you.
Pedrinho.
Do I have time for one more question?
Yes, sure. I guess, is it okay, Professor? Have like one
I'll
or
stay
two
as late as you guys will. I'll stay the next 3 hours. If you're willing to ask me questions, I'm so flattered that anyone wants to know my opinions. That
I guess it's like it's lunchtime
all night.
there. You're approaching to your lunchtime in Australia. Okay. Pedrinho, go on.
Salvatore, I was here reminding that in the 90s, post-industrial societies were very, very, very popular, and post-industrial society. So when I think about the world system, I in my in my knowledge, from the beginning of the 19th century, the world system went in a new phase because industrialization became a source of profits, and industrialization changed the societies. Industrialization created a new political class, the labor parties, Marx, the communist parties, and the national states when they tried to industrialize and in order to create a national state. So as I see, industrial societies or the world system changed deeply with industrialization. And what do you think about we are going in a phase that all the main features or characteristics of the world system in terms of national states, class relations, labor, ways of labor, and so on, it will change deeply in the next let's say 20, 30 years, 3 decades ahead. What do you think about that?
Look, I really do think we're in a period of transition. I know every generation believes it's in a period of transition, but you know, I think it really is true. If we look at, if I take that one step further and think about modernity and post-modernity, modernity started more than 500 years ago, and we still don't have a word for it because modern just means current, right? So in the modern era, we defined the medieval age as something that happened in the past. So now we have the Middle Ages as past, just as in the Middle Ages, eventually by the end of the Middle Ages, they thought of the ancients as the past, right? And so we're at the end of modernity, and we can now we hopefully in the next 50 years, we'll give a name to that era, 1500 to 2000. And we'll have a name for it that's not just modern, because modern just means current. We'll have a name that was the physical era, that was the sovereignty era, that was the something era. And in the same way, that word post-industrial, well, it's an empty word. We know there was an industrial economy. What's the post-industrial economy? Well, we don't know. We thought it might be the services economy, but I really think that services economy was a transitional phase. And I think what we'll arrive at is a network economy, that what's going to matter for all of us is our position in networks and our position in multiple networks, much more than our position in hierarchies. And so we might ultimately think that the industrial economy disappeared and we now live in the network economy or the netware economy, but I don't know. It's certainly happening in the sense that the most important, highest value production networks are not industrial production networks. That's simply the past, and we can all see that when we look at companies, when we look at individual salaries. You know, when we look at the former labor aristocracy of manufacturing workers, that's the past. What will this new world we're already in mean for class relations? Will there even be classes? I mean, the entire idea of a class analysis, is an artifact of the industrial age. Are there still social classes in a post-industrial age? Or are there just levels of income, right? I mean, this is a big debate that people in the world of class analysis have had. Is class still relevant? Is there such thing as class? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's the right question. That instead of saying, you know, what are the new social classes, we could just ask, well, what is class analysis time situated? And class analysis was something for the industrial age of 1800 to 2000. And it reached its height in the late 19th century. And that's why our giants of theorizing class wrote in the late 19th century. And now we're in an age that is some other form of hierarchy that's not a class hierarchy. It's still hierarchical. But is it no longer a class hierarchy and it's just something else? Yeah, what it is, I don't know. I'm not omniscient enough to know you know, what it is that's become the new hierarchy. I guess what I'd like to frame this for everyone is, the question is, what is the principle on which hierarchies are founded? And those Marxian class hierarchies, I think, are no longer relevant. Even Weberian class hierarchies are no longer relevant. What are the new hierarchies? They're emerging. I'm not an expert on it.
Okay, thank you very much, Salvatore. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Sorry, to make that very practical, an Uber driver and an Uber customer, it's a very hierarchical relationship in a way. But what kind of hierarchy is it? Right? And these are the sorts of things we have to figure out in social science.
Okay.
Yeah, but
Okay.
I don't know. I think it's an issue of income hierarchy, right?
Well, I would put it differently. The hierarchy causes the income differentials. So class hierarchies resulted in income differentials. It wasn't income differentials that caused class hierarchies. You know, it was your position in the class hierarchy led to your income level. Well, now there's a non-class hierarchy that's determining your income levels. What is that hierarchy? I don't know. I could be fashionable and say it's your information hierarchy, and it's, you know, your level of control over information, but I don't know that that's true. That's just the sort of thing people are saying.
I see. Okay, Roberta?
Hi, Professor. First, I would like to thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting and, you know, opening for us, and it's an honor. I assure you to receive someone who has been so productive and so heterodox, as you were saying before, to give us, you know, new ideas, new perspectives. I can't help but think, what would be the Latin America's role? Maybe would there be a shift in Latin America's role in this postmodern world that's being built? I mean, maybe we are failing to follow this increasing production diversity. We are holding back. You know, we are not following the rest of the world economically wise, I think. Or especially Brazil, we are now losing even our diplomatic advantages, let's put it that way. So my question is, how do you see that? Will there be this shift maybe in Latin America's world? And just about what you guys were discussing before, I think that we can see this matter of class through new lenses, through intersectionality lenses, maybe. I'm very interested in decolonial studies. So for me, maybe it's not just a matter of income, maybe there are other categories that we can intersect to see this new perspective. So okay, that's it.
So the second question first. Intersectionality is a good example of what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily class in any way. If we talk about the intersection of gender, sexualities, race, coloniality, you can even throw in some form of exploitation if you want, direct exploitation, but okay, those are hierarchies. They're relationships. Are they social classes? I mean, you can use the word class, but they don't connect to Marxist or Weberian theories of class. I mean, they're not connected to our entire intellectual tradition of what class means, which has always been based on employment. And so I think maybe if we wanted a successor to class, we might talk about forms of employment. So instead of thinking about workers, managers, and owners, we might think of gig workers, formal economy, informal economy. Well, that's not a class division. It's an economic division that also intersects with gender and sexuality and race, right? So, the last thing I would do is say that we don't have to think about hierarchies, exploitation, and oppression. I'm just saying that in any classical sense, there are no longer class hierarchies, class exploitation. There's something else that needs to be better theorized. Latin America, look, I'm not a Latin Americanist. I've never been to mainland Latin America. I've only been to Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, unless you count Phoenix and San Diego as part of Latin America, which maybe they are, El Paso. I'm just not a specialist. I mean, but if you take the logic of my opening slides, Latin America has become a periphery, and I use that word advisedly. Giovanni Arrighi would say semi-periphery in a modern world system structure. I would say in the emerging world system structure, it's just purely peripheral in the sense that Latin America could fall off the world economy. I don't wish this upon you, but could fall into the oceans. And the rest of the world economy would adjust a little bit. Okay, Australia would have to produce more iron. Boeing would have to produce more airplanes. You'd have to exploit lithium mines in Nevada instead of in Chile. But really, it's not well integrated. In the same way that if Germany were to drop out of the world economy, there'd be lots of network holes, right? So Latin America is on the edges of the network. Germany is closer to the center of the network. And of course, if California dropped out of the world economy, the whole world economy would be restructured, right? It would no longer be recognizably the same world economy. Now, being peripheral in the network is not an insult. That's just a statement of network position. What Latin American countries and individuals can do to change that position, I don't know. I mean, it'll be very difficult to be closer to the center of the network, and maybe not even necessary. So all of this, there's some kind of, we get caught up in the pride. People accuse me of being an American imperialist because I think the US is at the center of the world. And I point out that I much prefer to live in Australia. I mean, I'm not I'm not lauding America to say it's imperialist any more than Tacitus was lauding Rome when Tacitus wrote Germania and was saying that, he was admiring the Germans and wanting to live among them, and he thought Rome was decadent, but he saying that Rome was the imperial center was accurate, even if it wasn't a pleasant imperial center or an admirable imperial center. So there's not necessarily a value in bringing Latin America into the center. Raising living standards, absolutely. But Australia is a good example of how a country can have very high living standards without being anywhere in the central nodes of the global economic network. Australia, like Latin America, could disappear and Brazil would have increased demand for iron. Indonesia would have increased demand for coal, and the rest of the world wouldn't notice Australia dropping into the ocean. But Australia has a very high quality of life. very high incomes, $65,000 a year GDP per capita, very good social policy, low levels of social problems, universal health care, et cetera. So, Australia might be much more of a model for development than trying to be back at the center, so to speak.
Okay, so let me make one last question, and taking advantage of the fact that you live in Australia. As far as I understand, you are an American. You were born in the US.
Oh yeah, yeah. I've been here. I'm absolutely American.
And your name is very Italian. So you have Italian ascendancy or not? Or
my mother's family is Italian. My grandfather, after whom I'm named, is ultimately from Palermo. My grandmother's, but they're all born in the U.S. So my family's been in the U.S. for 3-4 generations. My grandfather's family was Sicilian from Palermo, grandmother's from Apulia, from Altamura. My father's family is all from Kalamata in the Peloponnese, in Greece.
Okay, so
Babones, by the way, is misspelled Greek. It should be Babones, Bebonis. They misspelled it at Ellis Island. And it's the only other baboneses in the world is when Spanish speakers misspell baboon. And instead of thinking it's a babuino, which is the Spanish, I don't know the Portuguese, but in Spanish it's babuino, they spell it babone. And then so Babones is either me or a troop of misspelled baboons on the internet.
Nice. So, so what I wanted to ask is that you living in Australia, you were talking about Australia already. What's the place that Australia sees itself in the next decades or next years in this global competition between US and China? I guess this is one question that is pretty much usual to you, especially after the AUKUS stuff. And is it overrated? Like, Australia has always been part of the Commonwealth, and there's no big deal or big news in joining US and UK, right? So what's the big fuzz about it, right?
There is a split among the Australian establishment between those who want Australia to remain an Anglosphere, English US country, and those who want to see Australia have a more autonomous role in the world. The irony is that the people who want Australia to have a more autonomous role in the world are overwhelmingly Anglo-Australians. That is, they are not, it's not, Asian Australians seem very comfortable with Australia being an Anglosphere country. That's why they came here. So the Anglo-Australians who want more policy autonomy for Australia tend to support the Republican movement, so get rid of the Queen. Remember, Queen Elizabeth is the Queen of Australia, and has a Governor General here in Sydney who is technically the presence of the Crown in Australia. Queen Elizabeth is on all our money, or all the coins at least have Queen Elizabeth's head on them. So the people who want Australia to transition to a republic and to chart an autonomous course and give up the US alliance and have promoted that Australia can leverage China relations to become more autonomous in the world. Quite ironically, like I said, are personally very Anglo-Australian. They're also the people who are really promoting Aboriginal and Indigenous issues in Australia. So I've never been to an event where an Indigenous person felt the need to do a welcome to country. But white Australians, Anglo-Australians, will regularly start events. Some of them even now put on their email. I'm not kidding. I am emailing from Gadigal land that was never ceded. And I think, well, then why don't you leave? It's Gadigal land. What are you doing on it? And why don't you give the Gadigal people title to your house? But it's very much a statement of identity. And so, yes, there's this big divide in Australia within the establishment. It's not establishment versus anti-establishment. It's a divide within the Anglo-Australian establishment, with the dominant arm wanting to maintain closer ties with the US. By that, I mean the Liberal Party in Australia and the Labour right, if that's not a contradiction in terms, but the establishment wing of the Labour Party, whereas the more radical wing of the Labour Party would like to see Australia and the Greens would like to see Australia become an autonomous country in the globe, very much like New Zealand. As an outsider, I don't want to put a value on this. I mean, New Zealand has already done this. So New Zealand has, in effect, disavowed the U.S. alliance. They're still technically in ANZUS, but U.S. forces are not allowed in New Zealand. New Zealand is demilitarized. New Zealand even advised Australia. The New Zealand foreign minister even said to Australia, stop antagonizing China, essentially. You know, we know how to deal with China. It's to express our subservience. So, you know, I wouldn't be proud if I were a New Zealander, but New Zealand has already taken that route. And there's a large group in Australia who want that route as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor, again, for your participation, for your lecture, and your kindly responses to our questions. And that's it. I'm going to close it in Portuguese. Então é isso, pessoal. Fechamos hoje o segundo dia do colóquio com essa ótima palestra do professor Salvatore Babones. E amanhã nós continuamos às 10 da manhã com a próxima mesa. Correto? Então é isso, Fabinho, Pedrinho, alguma mensagem?
I would like only to thank you, to thank the professor. Thank you, professor, for this very, very inspiring lecture. I think it left us a lot to think about. That is for us is a great profit, let's say. Thank you very much.
And thank you for being, you know, very well, so nice, but also very charitable and listening to a viewpoint you may not agree with. But you know, I put no value into this container. It's just my description of how I see the world.